Hey guys, tonight we're slipping back through time to a place where the sun blazed down on dusty arenas, where the air smelled like sweat and crushed olives, and where the human body, greased up and gleaming, was considered the ultimate tribute to the gods. Picture it, a bustling crowd in linen robes, a chorus of vendors calling out over the chatter, and rows of competitors stretching under the hot Mediterranean sky, their skin shining like polished bronze. So, before you get too comfortable, take a moment to like and subscribe, but only if you genuinely enjoy what I do here. And while you're here, let me know what time it is and where you're tuning in from. I love seeing how far these sleepy stories reach. Now dim the lights, maybe turn on a fan for that soft background hum, and let's ease into tonight's journey together. Greek culture. Oh, it was a world that absolutely adored the body, not just in a yeah, I'm healthy kind of way, but in an obsessed kind of way. In ancient Greece, the body wasn't just a vessel, it was a living, breathing canvas of strength, discipline, and beauty. The ideal man was lean, muscular, symmetrical, a perfect blend of form and function. Think of it as their version of a six-pack Instagram post, only, carved into marble and set in the middle of a temple. But here's where it gets interesting. The Greeks didn't just admire the body from a distance, they worshipped it. They built statues of gods with chiseled abs, sculpted athletes mid-stride, and held the Olympics not just as a sporting event, but as a way to honour the gods through the human form. And how did they honour that form? Well, they rubbed themselves down with olive oil. Lots of it. Olive oil wasn't just cooking grease in the Greek world, it was liquid gold. It came from groves that stretched across the hillsides, tended by farmers who knew exactly when to harvest the ripest fruit. The oil was used in medicine, religious rituals, cosmetics, and yes, athletic competitions. Athletes believed that oil highlighted their muscles, protected their skin from the harsh sun, and, let's be honest, made them look extra shiny when they were flexing at the starting line. The whole oiling up process became a kind of ritual. Picture an athlete standing in the sun, massaging oil into his arms and chest, rubbing it into his legs, making sure every inch of skin gleamed under the light. It wasn't just practical, it was a statement. And as much as it was about looking good, it was also about feeling good. The oil warmed the muscles, loosened the skin, and gave the athlete a sense of readiness. You can almost imagine the sensation, the slick texture on the fingertips, the scent of fresh olives mixed with the salty breeze, the warmth as it seeped into sore joints. Not everyone was a fan, though. Some philosophers grumbled that all this focus on appearance was vanity. Historians still argue whether the Greek obsession with oil was about true health benefits, or just a way to show off in front of the crowd. But regardless of the reason, the sight of a row of oiled-up athletes was part of the spectacle of the games. And it wasn't just for the competitors. The crowd, families, traders, priests, would all gather to watch these gleaming bodies compete, a living tribute to the gods. Imagine the dust rising in the heat, the shimmer of sunlight on bare skin, the low murmur of prayers to Zeus before a race. It was more than a sporting event. It was a sacred moment, a celebration of what the human body could achieve if only it were trained, disciplined and, of course, properly oiled. And as the crowds cheered and the athletes prepared for the races, the oil would drip onto the ground, mixing with the dust, creating a kind of ancient slip hazard. But more on that later. In the ancient Greek world, olive oil wasn't just a tool for athletes. It was everywhere. It filled homes, temples, workshops, even the ships that carried trade across the seas. And while today we might think of olive oil as a humble cooking ingredient, back then, it was wealth in a jar. Imagine walking through an Athenian marketplace, the air warm and dusty, merchants calling out their prices, amphorae stacked high, each filled with oil so rich and golden it shimmered in the sun. You'd see traders haggling over prices, citizens dipping fingers into clay pots to test the quality, and even athletes, fresh from the gymnasium, buying their own supply for training. This was liquid gold, quite literally. The best oil came from the first press of the olives, a smooth, fragrant stream that poured into vessels like treasure. And that treasure? It wasn't just for food or fuel. Olive oil lit the lamps in homes. It anointed the foreheads of newborns. It blessed the dead before burial, and it was offered in temples as a sacred gift to the gods. It even had its own sacred tree, the olive tree of Athena, which legend says she gifted to the city of Athens itself, a tree so revered that harming it was a serious crime. Steal or damage an olive tree, and you could be exiled, or worse. But the Olympic connection, that's where it gets especially interesting. Victors at the Games didn't just walk away with bragging rights, they received an olive wreath, made from branches of the sacred wild olive tree near Zeus's temple. It wasn't about gold or silver medals, it was about this deep, symbolic link to the gods and the earth. And here's a quirky fact for you. Olive oil was such a big deal that entire city-states built their economies around it. In some places, it was more valuable than wine, and more sought after than spices, and that led to all kinds of political drama. Historians still argue whether olive oil trade was the true backbone of the Mediterranean economy, or if its importance has been slightly romanticised over time. Either way, there's no denying the sheer reach of the stuff. But here's where it gets a little weirder. Olive oil wasn't just for rituals and fancy dinners, it was also part of some, let's say, questionable medical practices. Got a toothache? Rub some oil on it. Upset stomach? Swallow a spoonful. Trouble sleeping? Olive oil bath. Ancient problems, ancient solutions. It even made its way into cosmetics. Greek women, and some men, used olive oil as a moisturiser, a hair treatment, even a kind of primitive sunscreen. Though, whether it actually worked as a sunscreen is up for debate. And perhaps the most peculiar of all, olive oil was sometimes used in ancient, romantic activities. Let's just say it was considered a versatile substance, and leave it at that. So while the athletes might have oiled up for the games, they were part of a much bigger culture, one that saw olive oil as a gift from the gods, a source of wealth, and a vital part of daily life. As we drift on, picture the shimmering olive groves under the sun, the jars clinking together in a merchant's cart, and the soft glow of an oil lamp in a quiet home. Next, we'll explore why the athletes took it one step further and stripped down entirely for their events, and all the odd little customs that came with that bold decision. Nudity. In ancient Greece, it wasn't just a fashion choice, it was a way of a life, especially in athletics. The idea of competing in the Olympics fully clothed? Oh no, that would have been considered downright strange. Picture the dusty arena, the sun beating down, rows of athletes lined up at the starting line, their skin gleaming with oil, and not a scrap of clothing in sight. The only thing they wore was, well, confidence. The Greeks believed the naked body was a tribute to the gods, a symbol of physical perfection. Competing without clothes was a way to show off that body, to say, look what I've achieved, look what the gods have given me. But also, let's be real, it was a bit of a flex. There's even a story, one of those quirky little myths, that claims the tradition started when a runner named Orsippus accidentally lost his tunic during a race, and still won. After that, nudity became the norm, a wardrobe malfunction that changed history. Now, not everyone was thrilled about this. Some of the older philosophers grumbled that competing naked was indecent, that it encouraged vanity, or even led to, certain distractions in the gymnasium. Historians still argue whether the nudity was truly about honouring the gods, or if it was just the Greeks being the Greeks, open, confident, and perhaps a little too comfortable. And it wasn't just about showing off muscles, the oil played a big part too. A naked, oiled-up body wasn't just pretty, it was practical. The oil helped prevent chafing, kept the skin supple in the sun, and made it harder for opponents to get a good grip during wrestling. It turned the body into a slippery, glistening challenge. But there were, let's say, some side effects. Imagine running full speed on a dusty track, without any support. Things might bounce, jostle, and let's just say there were some awkward moments when athletes had to adjust mid-race. There were even special trainers called paidotribai, whose job was to supervise the athlete's physical conditioning, including the oiling and massaging, and yes, sometimes offering advice on how to avoid excessive swinging. This open attitude toward nudity didn't stop at the stadium. In the gymnasiums, men trained, oiled up and relaxed, all while fully exposed. It was a space for exercise, yes, but also for socialising, debating philosophy, and sometimes just lounging around. Of course, women were strictly banned from attending the Olympics. Well, except for one notable exception, the priestess of Demeter, who had a front row seat to all the action. Why her? No one's really sure. Historians still debate whether it was a religious privilege or a quirk of ancient tradition that somehow just stuck. There's even a story of a woman named Calipatera who disguised herself as a man to watch her son compete. When she was discovered, she was allowed to go free because her family had produced so many Olympic victors, but after that, they made a rule: no more women in the arena. So, as you picture the sun-baked stadium, the dust swirling in the breeze, and the glistening bodies sprinting down the track, it wasn't just a race, it was a full display of Greek ideals: strength, beauty, and a little bit of, well, audacity. And in the next part of our story, we'll explore how oil didn't just make you look good, but might have actually kept you alive in some of the more brutal events. Now, let's talk about the practical side of things. Because as much as oil was about shining in the sun, there were some very real reasons ancient athletes slathered themselves in the stuff, especially when it came to the brutal world of competition. Imagine standing in the scorching heat of Olympia, the dust sticking to your skin, the roar of the crowd in your ears, and your opponent, a mountain of muscle, eyeing you like a wolf about to pounce. That's where the oil came in. For runners, it wasn't just about the flex. A thin layer of oil helped prevent sunburn. Well, sort of. They didn't have SPF 50 back then, so it was more like a hopeful barrier against the sun's harsh rays. Historians still argue whether it was effective sun protection, or just wishful thinking mixed with tradition. For wrestlers, oil was a whole different game. Picture two men locked in a sweaty, dusty embrace, each one trying to pin the other to the ground. Add oil into that equation, and it's a recipe for chaos. The body became slick, harder to grab, the arms slipping and sliding across sweaty skin. It turned the contest into a slippery chess match, where strategy mattered as much as strength. And then there was the pancration, the no-holds-barred, no pads, no mercy event where everything except biting and eye gouging was fair game. Imagine stepping into a bare patch of ground. Your opponent already oiled up, their skin gleaming in the sun, fists clenched, breathing steady. The oil made things harder, more dangerous even. Fighters could slip, stumble, lose their grip, but it also meant fewer cuts and scrapes from the rough ground. A slick body could slide out of a chokehold, or escape a brutal headlock just long enough to counter. And here's where it gets a little quirky. Some athletes took it a step further. They experimented with oil mixed with sand or even dust to create a kind of grip enhancer, like ancient Greek chalk. Others used special blends of oils infused with herbs they believed would give them an edge. A little more stamina, a little less pain. But it wasn't just athletes who used oil for protection. Greek warriors would rub oil on their bodies before heading into battle, partly for the symbolism of strength, and partly because they thought it helped prevent injuries. There's even a story, though historians still argue if it's true, of certain soldiers oiling up to help their skin slide against enemy blades. And while the athletes might not have been facing spears in the arena, they were still in danger. Broken bones, dislocated joints, even deaths were not unheard of. The oil, in a way, was like ancient body armour, offering just a little protection against the violence of the games. Of course, not everyone saw it that way. Some grumbled that the oil made matches unfair, that a slippery opponent couldn't be held down. Others thought it was just a way to show off, a bit of extra flair for the fans in the stands. But no matter what people thought, the oil was part of the ritual. From the moment an athlete entered the gymnasium to the final scrape of the strigil at the end of the day, oil was as much a part of Greek sport as the laurel wreaths and the marble statues. Picture it. The crowd roaring, the dust swirling, and two oiled-up bodies straining in the heat, every muscle glistening under the sun. It wasn't just a spectacle, it was survival. Next, we'll meet the tool that made all this oiling possible, and maybe a little gross. Let's talk about the strigil. The oil had a curious companion in the athlete's daily routine. The strigil, a simple tool, but an essential one. Picture a thin, curved blade of bronze about the length of a forearm, cool to the touch, slightly dulled at the edges to avoid cutting the skin. After the competition, after the body had been thoroughly oiled, sweated and covered in dust, this little tool came into play. The strigil wasn't sharp enough to slice, but it was perfect for scraping. Athletes would stand there, muscles taut and gleaming, and a trainer or assistant would drag the strigil across the skin, pulling away a thin layer of oil, sweat and grime. It was a rhythmic sound, a soft scraping in the open air, the hiss of metal over skin, over and over. And what happened to all that scraped off gunk? That's where it gets, well, a little gross. The mixture of oil, sweat and dirt called gloios wasn't just discarded. Oh no, it was often collected, stored in little jars, and in some cases are sold. That's right. People would actually buy this stuff. They believed it had medicinal properties, that rubbing a bit of an athlete's gloios on your body could cure aches, improve circulation, maybe even transfer a bit of that athletic glory. Imagine heading to the market, asking for a small jar of wrestler's essence, and hoping it'd fix your back pain. Historians still debate whether this practice was widespread, or just a fringe idea among the more, let's say, optimistic buyers. But the fact that it happened at all tells us something about the culture. It wasn't just about the games, it was about the body itself, the sweat, the oil, the effort. These were seen as sacred, almost magical. The strigil wasn't just a tool for cleaning, it was a ritual act, a way to cleanse and renew. And it wasn't limited to athletes. Philosophers, soldiers, even ordinary citizens sometimes used a strigil after bathing. The scraping motion was thought to invigorate the skin, stimulate the blood, even ward off sickness. It's almost like the ancient version of a wellness spa treatment, complete with exfoliation and a healthy dose of ancient pseudoscience. The strigil itself could be quite beautiful. Some were plain, sure, just simple bronze tools, but others were engraved with patterns, inscriptions, even little dedications. They were personal objects, something an athlete might carry with pride like a modern-day water bottle or gym bag. And yet, they were also practical. After a long day of competition, imagine the relief of scraping off the sticky mixture, the fresh air on clean skin, the feeling of starting over, ready for the next challenge. But it wasn't all smooth sailing. The process could sometimes cause cuts or irritation, and there were stories of overzealous trainers scraping too hard, leaving scratches or bruises. Still, it was part of the game. The image of an oiled, scraped athlete became part of the cultural iconography, depicted on pottery, in sculptures, in ancient art. The gleaming skin, the rhythmic scraping, the soft clatter of strigils being cleaned afterward, it all created a kind of ritual soundtrack to the ancient games. And so, in the heart of Olympia, among the cheers and the dust, the strigil scraped away the day's efforts, leaving behind a clean slate and perhaps, for some, a little jar of glory to take home. The oil, the strigil, the gleaming bodies, they were just part of the spectacle. But beneath the shimmer and the ritual, there was something deeper at play, a connection to the gods, and to the very essence of being human. It wasn't all muscle and oil. The Greeks saw their athletic rituals as offerings too. In the world of the ancient Olympics, every act had a spiritual echo, a deeper layer that connected earth to sky, sweat to the divine. The oil wasn't just practical or aesthetic, it was a symbol, a liquid thread between man and God. Imagine standing in the sanctuary of Olympia, the air thick with incense, the distant sound of prayers rising to Zeus, and the sight of athletes, their bodies gleaming, moving like statues come to life. The oil shimmered in the light, catching the attention of the gods above, it was said. There's this fascinating idea that the very act of oiling up, of tending to the body, was a kind of worship, a way of preparing the vessel for divine attention. The games themselves were held in Zeus's honour after all. Athletes would dedicate their performances, their victories, their very sweat to him, and in a way the oil became a visible part of that offering, a sacred glow under the Mediterranean sun. Before competitions, athletes might make small sacrifices, pouring out a libation of wine or breaking bread at the altar, but they also had their bodies as offerings. To stand in the arena, naked, oiled, ready, was to say, look at what I've built, look at how I honour you. And it wasn't just Zeus, there were other gods too. Small altars dotted around the sanctuary, little shrines to local deities, river spirits, even ancestors. Athletes might whisper a quick prayer as they oiled their arms, or press a finger into the earth as they prepared to compete. One quirky tidbit, there's a story of athletes sometimes rubbing their oil into statues of the gods, as if transferring a bit of their own energy into the marble. Whether it was superstition or tradition, historians still argue, but it shows just how tangled athletics and religion were in the Greek mind. And for the spectators, watching an oiled, gleaming body wasn't just about admiring muscles. It was a reminder of the god's perfection reflected in human form. The human body, sculpted, strong, balanced, was seen as a small echo of the divine. There's something kind of beautiful about that. The idea that every step, every flex, every bead of oil on the skin was a tribute, a living hymn to the gods of Olympus. But it wasn't always so noble. For some athletes, the oil was more about practical concerns. It protected the skin from the sun, yes, but it also made them look good. It became a performance, part worship, part marketing, part personal brand. And sometimes, the oil wasn't even for the gods at all. It was for the fans in the stands, the admirers, the would-be patrons who might reward a victor with a new home, a lifetime supply of olive oil, or even a fancy statue back in their hometown. So while the oil had deep roots in religion, it also had a foot in the very human world of ambition, ego, and, well, showing off. As the strigil scraped and the oil flowed, there was always that duality between the sacred and the practical, the devotion and the vanity, the shimmering skin, the scent of olives, the flicker of a prayer before the race. It was all part of the ritual, part of the pageantry, part of the ancient Olympic experience. And while the oil made you shine, it also made you vulnerable. Because when it came to those pre-game massages, well, things got a little complicated. The pre-game massage, now that was a ritual in its own right. Before the competition began, athletes would gather in the gymnasium, stripped down, oiled up, and ready for their trainers to work their magic. But this wasn't some relaxing spa treatment with soft music and cucumber slices. No, this was part preparation, part punishment, and a little bit of ancient science mixed in for good measure. Picture it. A warm, dusty room, the smell of sweat and crushed olives heavy in the air, the murmur of voices echoing off the stone walls, and rows of athletes lying on the ground or seated on benches as trainers rubbed oil into their muscles. The oil wasn't just for show, it was the first step in a full-body tune-up. Trainers, known as paidotribai, had a job that was equal parts coach, massage therapist, and, let's be honest, drill sergeant. They'd knead the oil deep into the skin, pressing into muscles, stretching limbs, and sometimes slapping an athlete on the back to wake up the nerves. It wasn't exactly gentle. These massages were designed to warm the body, increase circulation, and loosen the joints, like a mechanic fine-tuning an engine before a big race. And they didn't just use their hands. There were special tools, rounded stones, scrapers, even padded sticks, that they'd roll over the skin to help break up tension. Some trainers swore by their own secret massage techniques, using circular motions for the shoulders, firm strokes for the calves, and quick rhythmic taps for the chest. The oil itself? Sometimes it was just plain olive oil, but more often it was mixed with herbs, rosemary, thyme, maybe a pinch of sea salt. Some blends were said to invigorate the senses, others to calm the mind, and still others, well, to keep certain areas of the body from reacting to all the stimulation. There were even rumours, though historians still debate whether it's true, that certain trainers would deliberately not oil up certain parts of the body, like the hands, to make sure the athlete had a better grip during events like wrestling. A little tactical oiling, if you will. But these massages weren't just physical. They were mental preparation too. As the trainer worked, they'd offer encouragement, go over strategies, and sometimes throw in a light joke to ease the tension. Imagine a young runner, nervous before his first race. The trainer patting his shoulder, saying, "Just remember, don't trip over your own feet." It was a bonding moment, an exchange of trust, a quiet acknowledgement that once the massage ended, it was time to face the crowd, the gods, and the competition. Of course, not everyone loved the experience. Some athletes grumbled about the rough handling, the sharp elbows digging into sore muscles, or the occasional awkwardness of being completely exposed while a trainer worked a little too close for comfort. But it was part of the package. The massage was the final step in a long line of preparation. After the oiling, the prayers, the warm-ups, it was the last chance to focus, to breathe deeply, to feel the body coming alive under the trainer's hands. And then, once the oil had been rubbed in, the muscles warm, the joints loose, it was time. the athlete would rise, step onto the sand, and face the arena. The crowd would roar, the sun would blaze, and the slick, glistening bodies would move like living statues, ready to chase glory or to slip and stumble in the dust. But not all oiling was innocent. Sometimes it was a little too helpful, a little too slippery. That's where the whispers of cheating began to stir. Cheating. It was as much a part of the ancient Olympics as olive wreaths and victory chants. The Greeks may have worshipped fair competition, but they were also, let's say, realistic about human nature. Oil. Well, that opened up a whole new playbook of tricks. A little extra shine in the right place, a little too much slickness on the skin. And suddenly, you had a serious advantage, especially in events like wrestling or the pancration, where grip was everything. Imagine two athletes locked in a fierce struggle, arms wrapped, feet slipping in the dust, and one of them is oiled up just a little more than the other. His opponent can't get a proper hold, his hands slide off. Frustration builds. Was it intentional, or just a lucky sheen of sweat and oil under the sun? There were even stories of athletes applying oil to only certain parts of the body. Maybe they'd leave the hands dry for better grip, or coat the legs extra thick to make them hard to grab. It wasn't illegal, there were no written rules saying you couldn't, but it raised eyebrows. And then, there were the more creative schemes. Some athletes mixed powders or dust into their oil, creating a kind of primitive grip enhancer, or even added herbal concoctions believed to boost strength, stamina, or, less politely, ward off fatigue. Of course, these tricks didn't always go unnoticed. The officials at the games, the Hellanodikai, kept a sharp eye out for anything suspicious. If an athlete was caught cheating, whether by bribing an opponent using illegal substances or getting a little too clever with the oil, they faced public humiliation. And here's where it gets delightfully petty. The Greeks didn't just disqualify cheaters, they made an example out of them. The worst offenders had their names carved into bronze statues called zanes, which were placed along the entrance to the stadium. Every competitor would walk past those shame statues before their event. A silent reminder that the gods and the officials were watching. It was a brutal form of public shaming. Imagine training for years, only to see your name chiselled into a statue that future generations would point at and say, "Ah, that guy, the one who cheated." Not exactly the legacy you'd hope for, but cheating wasn't limited to oil. Bribery was common. Rich city-states might pay off officials, or quietly offer incentives for an opponent to throw a match. Even magical practices crept in. Whispers of spells, charms, or curses being used to sway the outcome. Historians still argue how widespread this really was. Was cheating an open secret, or just a few bad apples spoiling the pot? The truth, as with so much of history, is probably somewhere in the middle. And yet, even with all this trickery, the games held a certain sacredness. The rituals, the oiling, the oaths before Zeus, it all created a sense of reverence, a feeling that, yes, the gods were watching. But that didn't stop a few competitors from pushing their luck. Imagine the tension at the starting line, the glint of sun on oiled skin, the silent prayers, and the unspoken thought in the back of someone's mind. Did that guy cheat? The games were glorious, yes, but they were also messy, human, and sometimes a little slippery. And while oil could be an advantage, it was also a status symbol. Not everyone could afford the best oil after all, and that glossy glow wasn't just about sports, it was about who you were in society. That glossy, oiled-up glow, it wasn't just for the arena. In ancient Greece, the way a body shimmered under the sun was a status symbol, a statement that said, "I am strong, I am wealthy, I am somebody." Think about it. High-quality olive oil wasn't cheap. If you could afford to slather yourself in the best, you were sending a very clear message. It was like walking into a gym today with the latest sneakers, the fanciest headphones, and a personal trainer in tow. You weren't just there to sweat, you were there to be seen. And oh, were you seen? The Olympic athletes were celebrities in their time, admired, gossiped about, sometimes even immortalized in statues. The gleaming skin, the defined muscles glinting in the sun. It was a visual reminder of their dedication and their status. But it wasn't only athletes who wanted that shine. Wealthy men, philosophers, politicians, even merchants, would oil themselves up too. It was a sign of health, of youth, of being in tune with the ideals of Greek beauty. There are even ancient texts that mention men walking through the agora, the city square, with oiled skin looking for attention. Basically, the ancient version of flexing on Instagram. Of course, not everyone was impressed. There were plenty of old philosophers grumbling in the corners, muttering about vanity, about men spending too much time on their bodies and not enough on their minds. Historians still argue whether this obsession with the oiled body was a widespread cultural norm, or mostly an elite trend. Was it something every Greek aspired to, or just the wealthy few who had the time and the means to indulge? And yet, the symbolism of the oil went beyond the individual. A well-oiled body wasn't just a personal statement. It was a reflection of the city-state itself. The stronger, shinier and healthier its athletes, the more glory the city could claim at the games. That's why some cities went all out, funding their athletes, providing the finest oils, the best trainers, the top equipment. It was like an arms race of muscles and oil. The more your athletes won, the more prestige your city earned. There's even a quirky story about certain cities rationing olive oil during times of shortage, but making exceptions for their athletes. Food could be scarce, but those competitors had to shine. And for the athletes themselves, the oil was part of the performance. It wasn't enough to win. You had to look like a winner too. The gleam of the skin under the sun, the rippling muscles, the confident stride, it all worked together to create an image of near-divine perfection. It's a little funny, isn't it? All that pressure, all that shine. And yet, at the end of the day, they were still just people. Sweaty, nervous, competitive, sometimes cheating, sometimes getting their names etched into shame statues. But in that moment, oiled, glistening, standing under the Mediterranean sky, they felt like gods. And as we glide deeper into this story, we'll find that the debates didn't end in the arena. The philosophers of the agora had plenty to say about all this. And their opinions? Well, they weren't exactly subtle. The philosophers, they had a lot to say about all this oiling up and showing off. In the dusty corners of the agora, where men gathered to debate everything from politics to the nature of the soul, there was no shortage of opinions about the athletes strutting around like sun-glistened statues. Some praised them, of course, the gleaming skin, the disciplined bodies, the sheer dedication to the craft of athleticism. It was hard not to admire. They were, after all, living embodiments of the Greek ideal, kalokagathia, the blend of beauty and virtue. But others? Oh, they were less impressed. The old-school philosophers, the ones who liked their robes a little dustier and their minds a little sharper, muttered that all this focus on bodies was a distraction from the real business of life. Wisdom, virtue, the pursuit of the greater good. There are records of cranky scholars complaining about athletes being too focused on their muscles, too obsessed with the shine of their skin, too eager for applause. They grumbled that oil was a symbol of vanity, not virtue. A slippery excuse to bask in shallow admiration rather than do the hard work of the mind. Historians still argue whether this was a real cultural divide, or just a loud minority of thinkers wagging their fingers at the young and the strong. It's hard to say. Maybe it was a bit of both. And then there were the more practical concerns. Some philosophers raised questions about the oil's effectiveness. Was it really helping performance? Or was it just, well, ancient snake oil? Without modern science, they couldn't test it. They just had opinions. And boy, did they have opinions. There's even a quirky little debate that pops up in ancient texts, whether oiling up was more useful for endurance events or for the quick bursts of a sprint. Some argued that oil helped warm the muscles for short races. Others claimed it was better for keeping skin supple over long distances. And a few, always the skeptics, insisted it did nothing at all except make you look good under the sun. But even the skeptics had to admit there was something about the ritual of oiling. The smell, the feel, the way it gleamed in the light. It was a kind of mental preparation, a way to get into the zone before a match. And for the audience, it was all part of the show. They came not just for the competition, but for the spectacle. The shimmering bodies, the dramatic poses, the stories of glory and defeat. It's almost like watching a modern sports star today. Yes, you care about the game, but you're also there for the aura, the charisma, the feeling of being in the presence of someone special. The philosophers, with all their debates and their dusty robes, couldn't quite ruin that magic. They could argue all they wanted in the shaded corners of the agora, but when the crowd roared and the sun caught the glisten of oil on an athlete's shoulder, All those words just faded into the heat. The oil, the shine, the spectacle. It was part of the package, and no amount of philosophical grumbling could quite erase the thrill of watching a body in motion, gleaming in the sun, chasing glory. But as much as the oil could elevate you, it could also betray you. A little too much, a slippery misstep, and suddenly all that shine didn't help you at all. It's funny, isn't it? The very thing that made an athlete look like a god could also make him hit the dirt faster than you could say, pancretion. Oil wasn't always the helpful friend it seemed to be. There were times, especially in the heat of competition, when it became a traitor. Picture a wrestling match, two bodies straining, arms locked tight, feet grinding into the dust, and then a slip. The oil that made you shine so beautifully in the sun. Now a slick surface under your opponent's grip, a sudden slide that sent you tumbling. It happened. A lot. And it wasn't just the athletes who had to watch their step. The crowds would sometimes get caught up in the action, leaning in too close to the edge of the arena, where the ground was a mix of sand, dust, and yes, drips of oil. Imagine the shouts of vendors slipping, spectators stumbling, all because someone's carefully oiled leg brushed too close to the sidelines. There's even a quirky little account, though historians still argue over whether it's a real event or just an old story, that during one of the games, an official slipped in an oil patch, fell onto the track and accidentally triggered a false start in the race. Chaos ensued, but it wasn't just about slipping. Sunburns were a real concern too. The oil was thought to offer protection. But let's be honest, it wasn't exactly copper tone. For some athletes, the intense Mediterranean sun baked the oil right onto their skin, turning it into a sticky layer that trapped heat rather than deflecting it. Imagine standing out there, glistening, feeling your skin roast like a piece of lamb on a spit. And then there were the injuries. The pancreation, for instance, was already a dangerous event. Choke holds, joint locks, bare-knuckle strikes. The oil made it even riskier. An opponent's arm might slip free just when you thought you had them pinned. A hold might give way, leading to awkward falls or twisted limbs. Some competitors tried to get clever, wiping off their opponent's oil during a match, or sneaking a handful of sand onto their own skin to counter the slipperiness. There were no gloves, no uniforms, no padding, just bare skin, oil and wits. It was a high-stakes game of friction, or sometimes the lack of it. The oil wasn't always pure either. Cheaper, impure oils were more likely to turn rancid in the heat, leading to skin irritation, rashes, even infections. There are reports, though vague, of athletes suffering mysterious skin conditions after the games, their bodies marked not just by bruises but by strange, lingering sores. Historians still debate whether the Greeks fully understood the risks of excessive oiling, or if they simply accepted the hazards as part of the athletic life. Maybe it was just one of those things you learned the hard way. An awkward tumble here, a burn there, and the lesson was written on your skin. But despite all the slipping, sliding and sizzling, the oil never lost its place in the games. It was too woven into the fabric of the ritual, too much a symbol of the ideal body, to give up entirely, and so athletes kept oiling up, kept gleaming under the sun, kept slipping, burning, bruising, all in the pursuit of glory. And the thing is, oiling wasn't just for athletes. It seeped into every corner of Greek life, into homes, into rituals, into the daily grind. It was more than a sports tradition. It was a way of life. Oil. It wasn't just for the glory of the games. The ritual of rubbing it into the skin. It crept into every part of Greek life. Homes, temples, battlefields, even the quiet corners of the philosopher's study. In the gymnasiums, sure, athletes oiled up for the glory of competition. But outside those arenas, oil still held power. Warriors, for example, would oil their bodies before heading into battle. Not just for the skin protection, but as a kind of armour. The gleam of it caught the light, intimidating, a statement of readiness. Some believed it made their skin more resistant to the heat, or even, in rare cases, to blades. Historians still argue whether that's a stretch of the imagination, or if there was some truth to it. And then there were the philosophers. Yes, even the philosophers. It wasn't unusual to find an old thinker reclining in an olive grove, dictating notes while a servant massaged oil into his shoulders. Not quite the battle-hardened look, Bessius, but it shows just how widespread the practice had become. Even children were rubbed down with oil after birth, part ritual, part medicine, part simple care. There was a belief that a little oil helped the body grow strong, kept the skin soft, protected it from the elements. And in old age, well, oil became a kind of salve for the creaky joints and aches that came with a long life. Then there's the stranger stuff. Stories of olive oil used as an early form of contraception, or as a treatment for headaches, fevers, even snake bites. One particularly odd remedy claimed that if you rubbed oil onto your feet before bed, it would help you sleep better. Ancient sleep hygiene, perhaps. And of course, there were the religious uses. Olive oil burned in lamps across the Greek world. Temple lamps, household shrines, sacred flames. It was part of sacrifices, poured onto altars, drizzled over offerings. When you lit a lamp with oil, you weren't just making light. You were creating a connection to the divine. That same oil that an athlete smeared onto his chest before a race might also anoint the statue of a god. It was a bridge between worlds, the human and the sacred. But it wasn't cheap. The finest oils, the ones with that rich golden colour and smooth texture, were expensive. They came from the first press of the olives, carefully filtered, stored in special amphorae. The lower grades, thicker, cloudier, were used for everyday tasks. Lighting lamps, greasing wheels, waterproofing leather. It's a little humbling to think about, really. That the same oil that slicked up a champion sprinter in Olympia might also light a poor family's single-room home in Athens, or soothe a baby's skin in a cradle. It connected everyone in ways both grand and small, the shimmer on an athlete's biceps, the glow of a temple lamp, the simple meal of bread dipped in oil. It was all part of the same story. So when we talk about athletes covering themselves in oil, we're really talking about more than just a pre-game ritual. We're talking about a substance that wove through every part of life, from the sweaty grit of the arena, to the quiet moments by the hearth, to the sacred spaces where prayers rose in the flickering light. And in that shimmering world, where oil flowed like liquid gold, there were fortunes to be made, because where there's demand, there's always someone ready to supply it. Where there's oil, there's business. And in ancient Greece, the olive oil trade wasn't just a casual marketplace affair. It was an empire in itself, a network of groves, farmers, merchants and city-states, all hustling to profit from this golden liquid. Imagine the scene. Amphorae stacked in ships at the bustling port of Piraeus, the air heavy with the scent of salt water, olive leaves and wood tar. Merchants haggling over prices, sailors grunting as they load and unload crates, scribes tallying up inventories by hand. It was commerce, and it was cutthroat. The finest oil came from select regions, places where the soil was just right, where the trees had been carefully cultivated over generations. Athens prided itself on its oil, of course, but other city-states had their own prized groves. The competition wasn't just on the track, it was in the fields too. There's even a quirky little fact. Winners at certain athletic festivals, including some of the Panathenaic Games, didn't get a gold medal or a pile of coins. They got amphorae of olive oil, and not just a few, hundreds of litres of the finest top-tier first-press oil. That prize wasn't just a trophy, it was a fortune. An athlete could sell the oil, use it to curry favour with the wealthy, or distribute it as gifts to build alliances. And this prize oil wasn't for cooking dinner, it was too precious for that. It was for anointing, for rituals, for the kind of elite body care that only the wealthiest could afford. To walk through a city with the scent of premium olive oil clinging to your skin. That was a flex in ancient Greece, a symbol of wealth and status. The trade routes stretched far. Olive oil was shipped across the Aegean, to Egypt, to Italy, even as far as the Black Sea. And wherever it went, it carried the scent of Greece, a little taste of its land and culture bottled up and sent out into the world. But with demand came risk. Pirates knew the value of those ships laden with amphorae. Bandits might raid olive groves during harvest season, and some city-states, well, they weren't above a little sabotage. Rumours whispered of groves being poisoned, presses destroyed in the night, or harvests stolen under cover of darkness. Historians still debate how much of this was true, and how much was the ancient equivalent of trade gossip. But one thing's for sure, oil wasn't just a product, it was power. And for the athletes, it meant everything. The best oil, the best trainers, the finest facilities. These were often gifts from the wealthy. from patrons who wanted to see their city's name etched into history. An Olympic champion wasn't just an individual victory. It was a victory for the whole community. That's why city-states poured resources into their athletes, funding their training, building gymnasiums, and yes, supplying endless quantities of olive oil. Because every gleaming, oiled-up champion was a walking advertisement, a shimmering symbol of civic pride. And as the oil flowed, so did the stories. Tales of athletes winning by a hair's breadth, of rivalries settled in the dust of Olympia, of fortunes made and lost over a single amphora of liquid gold. It was commerce, it was culture, it was competition, and it all shimmered in the heat of the Mediterranean sun. But as with any golden age, it couldn't last forever. The groves would wither, the markets would shift, and the world would change, and soon the flow of oil and the world that revolved around it would start to dry up. The olive oil, it flowed for centuries, but even the mightiest groves couldn't last forever. The collapse didn't happen overnight, of course. It was a slow unravelling, a shifting of trade routes, a string of bad harvests, a war here, a plague there. Imagine a once thriving olive press, the stone wheels worn smooth, the air once thick with the scent of crushed fruit, now silent. The amphorae stand empty, dust gathering in the corners. The workers have moved on, the merchants have found new ventures, and the city-states that once measured their wealth in shimmering oil begin to feel the squeeze. One of the biggest blows came when the Romans expanded their empire. They had their own olive groves, their own oil production. Suddenly, Greek oil wasn't the only game in town. The market flooded, the prices dropped, and that liquid gold lost a little of its lustre. And then there were the wars. Raids destroyed groves, supply lines were cut, and those carefully cultivated trees that took years, even decades to mature, were easy targets. An invading army didn't have to burn down a city to cripple it. Just cut down the olive trees. Climate shifts too played their part. Historians still argue whether there was a true environmental collapse, or whether it was just a run of bad years, but the records hint at harvests growing smaller, at the quality of oil declining, at a sense of scarcity creeping into what was once a world of plenty. The festivals, the prizes, the amphorae overflowing with oil, they didn't vanish overnight, but their grandeur faded. The olive oil prizes at the Panathenaic Games, for example, became less extravagant. The number of amphorae awarded dwindled. For the athletes, this was more than an economic blow. Without the financial backing of patrons flush with oil profits, training became harder. The finest oils weren't as easy to come by. The best trainers, the best facilities, they all depended on the wealth generated by the groves. And yet, the ritual lingered. Even as the oil economy declined, the athletes still oiled up. Maybe it wasn't the first press, golden liquid from sacred groves anymore. Maybe it was a little thinner, a little less fragrant, but the ritual continued. The shimmer in the sun, the scrape of the strigil, the feel of oil on skin, it was too much a part of the culture to disappear completely. But the days of oil as empire, as power, as the defining wealth of a city, those were fading. By the time the Roman Empire truly took hold, Greek traditions were being absorbed, reinterpreted, and sometimes quietly set aside. The games themselves would eventually be outlawed by the Christian emperors, seen as too pagan, too wild, too naked. And with the games gone, the grand festivals gone, the olive oil trade lost one of its greatest stages. The amphorae stopped shipping. The groves grew over, the presses fell silent. But even then, the memory of those oiled-up athletes remained. In pottery, in statues, in the dusty scrolls left behind, the gleam of oil still shimmered, if only in the imagination. And so, the greasy golden age came to a quiet, dusty close. But the ritual, the shimmer, the sheer idea of oil, it left its mark, and maybe, in a quiet corner of a gymnasium, it still lingers today. The shimmering glow of oil, the naked athletes, the dusty stadiums, they all faded, but the legend never really disappeared. It's strange, isn't it? How something as simple as rubbing oil into the skin became a symbol of an entire culture, a way of living, of honouring the body, of reaching for the divine. When the games were finally banned, deemed too pagan, too wild, too much a relic of a bygone age. It wasn't just the athletes who lost something. The spectators, the merchants, the priests, the poets. They all lost a piece of that world. The echoes of the oiling tradition hung on, though, slipping quietly into other corners of life. In Roman baths, they massaged oil into the skin before scraping it away. In Christian rituals, anointing with oil became a sacred act, though the sweaty, slippery wrestlers of Olympia might not have recognised the solemn ceremony that grew from their old pre-game rituals. And even today, we still feel little traces of it. Athletes still oil up before competitions. Bodybuilders still use oil to highlight their muscles. Spa-goers still book oil massages, hoping for a little rejuvenation. There's something universal about it, something timeless. Historians still debate what it all meant. Was the oil about health, protection, vanity, or was it simply a cultural habit that stuck, like wearing shoes or shaking hands? Maybe it was all of those things, and maybe none of them. That's the funny thing about history. We try to pin down the meaning, but the past slips through our fingers just like oil. What's clear, though, is that the ancient Greeks lived in a world where the body mattered. It wasn't just a vessel to carry the mind. It was an artwork, a tool, a connection to the gods. And the oil, it was the medium that made that art shine. Picture it one last time. The golden sun setting over Olympia, the scent of olives on the breeze, the soft clatter of strigils against amphorae, and the glint of oil on skin, catching the light as an athlete steps into the arena, ready to face his fate. A ritual, a performance, a legacy. And as the crowds drifted home, the stadium emptying, the lamps burning low, maybe a few droplets of oil remained in the dust, a faint shimmer in the fading light, a reminder that in the end, we're all a little slippery. And as the night settles in, let's take a moment to slow down, to let the mind quiet and the body rest. The flicker of lamplight fades, the soft sounds of the ancient world grow dim, and the scent of crushed olives drifts away on the breeze. Let your breath slow, feel the weight of the blankets, the softness of the pillow beneath your head. The ancient games are over now, the crowds have gone home, and the shimmer of oil fades into the dark. Sleep well, friend, sleep well.